Here's Greg Kukl to give his elevator pitch for theism.
This one comes from Damon Hawkins. I'm overwhelmed by all the arguments and the challenge to properly balance apologetics and personal testimony. What is your elevator speech answer to the question, what do you believe and why do you believe it?
Well, the first question is, how tall is this building, by the way?
Good
the first
question.
The
What do you
first
mean by
question
that?
is it's very, very broad. Okay, and I guess I'd want to say that there is a God. I mean, again, the elevator speech. Okay, first three stories here. There is a God who is there.
What is a God, and what does it mean for that God to be there? My biggest issue is that I don't understand what a God is supposed to be. Apologists often claim that God is a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind, but to say that such a thing exists seems like a contradiction to me because I don't know what it means to say that anything exists if it doesn't occupy space or time. Nor do I understand how a mind, a neurological process, can exist without any kind of neurology to carry it out.
He has not been silent. Francis Schaeffer's title. He has visited this planet in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. He gave evidence of who he was and that did something to rescue us from ourselves.
If we are to take the stories about Jesus at face value, one could say that he gave evidence that he had some variety of paranormal powers, but I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that he gave evidence that he was God incarnate. In fact, there are passages in the Gospels that are evidence that Jesus is not God. For example, God is omniscient, but Jesus says that he doesn't know the day or hour when heaven and earth will pass away. As Christopher Hitchens famously said,
parthenogenesis is not completely unthinkable, but it does not prove that his paternity is divine. And it wouldn't prove that any of his moral teachings were thereby correct. Nor, if I was to see him executed one day and see him walking the streets the next, would that show that his father was God, or his mother was a virgin, or that his teachings were true, especially given the commonplace nature of resurrection at that time and place. After all, Lazarus was raised, never said a word about it. The daughter of Jairus was raised, didn't say a thing about what she'd been through. And the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So that it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived. So I'll give you all the miracles and you'll still be left exactly where you are now, holding an empty sack.
I use that Hitchens clip a lot because it is my favorite thing that he's ever said. With respect to Greg's assertion that he did something to rescue us from ourselves, I'm curious as to what that means exactly. Is rescuing us from hell the same as rescuing us from ourselves? A common apologist argument is that God doesn't send us to hell, we send ourselves to hell. If that's the case, if some of us make an informed, consensual choice to go to hell, then we must genuinely prefer it over heaven. If we prefer it, why do we need to be rescued from it? Why do we need to be rescued from ourselves voluntarily choosing to go there? The idea that we need to be saved from ourselves also seems to imply that we have no control over ourselves. If that's the case, why would we be morally responsible for our sins?
That will determine what happens to everybody in the final resurrection.
What's the final resurrection? What does that mean in a contemporary Christian context? One of the many fascinating things that I've learned from reading a lot of Bart Ehrman books is that Jews who lived in the time and place where Jesus lived believed in apocalypticism. This is the idea that when you die, you just stay dead until Judgment Day when everyone is judged, and those who were judged to be good are raised bodily from the dead, instead of their souls going to heaven, and those who are bad just stay dead. Few, if any, Christians today seem to believe in this. Rather, they say that when you die, you either go immediately to heaven or you go immediately to hell. If that's the case, then what happens on Judgment Day? What happens during the final resurrection?
Okay, that's maybe the content. At the end of history, maybe I'll put it that way for a non-Christian, all right?
As a non-Christian, I'm just as confused about what the end of history is supposed to be. I'm especially confused as to why the fate of my soul, if I have such a thing, is not decided until then rather than immediately after my death, given that judgment immediately after death seems to be the more common way that Christians portray the afterlife.
Why do I believe it? Well, this one, in a certain sense, I'll give the general point that I've given many times, because that answer about the nature of reality, okay, I'm not talking about my faith, my beliefs as such. Of course, they're my faith and belief, but what I believe about those things is that this is the way the world is.
Why do you believe that this is the way the world is? Not only does it not look at all to me like it is the way the world is, it doesn't even make any sense. It's not something I can even understand. The way Greg describes the world is not something I can even recognize as coherent.
Okay, and I think that this is an accurate take on the world. It's the accurate picture of reality taken as a whole, because it turns out to be the best explanation for the way things are.
How can an incoherent, self-contradictory assertion be any kind of explanation at all, let alone the best explanation for anything?
And so when you look at the way the world is, that the world came into existence.
The world, if by that you mean the universe, didn't come into existence. Not only does it not look to be the case, it is not even conceivably the case. The universe is the space-time continuum. Space-time cannot come into existence because something cannot come into existence at a time when it already occupies existence. And there was obviously never a time in the 13.7 billion years that time has existed that time did not exist. In order for something to come into existence, its existence has to be preceded by a time when it did not exist, which is logically impossible when we're talking about time itself.
That the world has conscious beings.
Consciousness is a process carried out by matter. Given that this is the case, it is a contradiction to say that an immaterial thing, as God is supposed to be, could ever be conscious. It makes even less sense that such a being is necessary for other material beings to carry out the essentially material process of consciousness. Even if consciousness were some spooky immaterial phenomenon, why would that require a God to exist?
That one set of the conscious beings, human beings, have a moral nature. Okay, and that concepts like mercy and goodness and justice and wickedness and evil, all of these are real parts of the universe.
I have no idea what it means to say that they are real parts of the universe. Is Greg saying that they exist as some kind of Platonic form? Because Platonic forms are proposed as having some kind of non-physical existence. I don't understand what it means to say that they exist either.
The worldview, the picture of reality that makes the most sense out of all of these things, turns out to be the Christian view of reality.
These things seem inherently nonsensical to me, so I don't know how any worldview can make sense of them.
And I can go into details about that, and this is the way, the motif that I use. For example, in the book we were just talking about, Street Smarts, I have 2 chapters on atheism, followed by 1 chapter on the problem of evil. And the chapter on the problem of evil is called Evil, Atheism's Fatal Flaw.
I haven't read Greg's book, but I'm going to guess that he makes the common apologist argument that the existence of evil isn't really a problem for theism because you need theism to account for the existence of evil. If that's his argument, it's not going to convince me because I don't, in fact, believe that evil exists. There are things that are intolerable to my conscience, but I don't understand what it would mean to say that those things fall into any objective category called evil. This is the case even if a God exists. Even if there is a God, and that God dictates morality, there is still no objective, non-circular reason why we ought to obey that morality. Why ought we do what God says? If you believe that all morality comes from God, then the only answer could be because God says so.
So I position the problem of evil not in a defensive way, like, well, let's see if I can find out how I can convince you that it makes sense in our world. I did that in the story of reality more. No, I'm trying to show there is a problem of evil, and that's not bad for us, it's bad for atheists.
Since I don't believe that there's any such thing as evil, I don't see how that's bad for me. However, if there were such a thing, why would a God, which is both morally perfect and all-powerful, allow such a thing to exist?
And here's why. Because, simply put, the problem of evil fits into our world. Our story is about the problem of evil from the beginning to the end. It starts in chapter 3, it ends 66 books later. So it fits in our story, and our story's not over yet.
It doesn't fit in your story. You might as well have a story about an unstoppable force and an immovable object existing in the same universe. It's self-contradictory.
It's just part of it. There's no real problem there in a certain sense. There are questions that come up that we can speculate on and try to answer. But the key thing is the problem of evil makes sense in our story. It does not make sense in the atheist's story.
Well, in my story, evil doesn't exist at all, so I don't need to make sense of it.
Okay, so there's one example of our view of reality being a much better explanation, in fact, the best explanation for evil.
Since evil doesn't exist, I don't see why it needs to be explained.
Or for the origin of the universe.
I don't believe that the universe had an origin, so I see no need for an explanation of that either.
Or for the existence of consciousness.
Consciousness is a process carried out by matter. I don't understand how something non-physical could explain it, much less would be needed to explain it. And even if consciousness were something non-physical, I still don't understand how the existence of a god would explain it.
Or the reality of human freedom.
I assume he means free will, which I also don't believe exists. I don't even believe the concept makes any sense. Apologists who insist that we have free will often say that our choices are not predetermined, but also that we control our choices somehow. Pick one. This is a contradiction. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.